that is one of our big advantages that we have over Brazil is our liquidity. Hi, this is Matthew Kruse with Commstock Investments. I'm going to start out talking about the weather again. If you're like me, you probably noticed that the Labor Day weekend was quite a bit cooler than normal. Eric Snodgrass says that it is the coldest, one of the coldest finishes to August that we've ever had on record since they began keeping track of that type of thing since 1893. Unusually cold, and we're trying to monitor and understand what that means for the crops. I think it's probably a double-edged sword where it could help stall some of the disease pressure that we've been seeing and hearing a lot about, which I think has become a problem. But on the other hand, in some of those areas, especially in the eastern corn belt that are so dry, it could kind of have an abrupt end to the crop there and kind of start to turn the crops there a little bit prematurely, sooner than expected. Kind of a positive and negative thing there on some of these cooler temperatures. So taking a look at the 2-week rainfall forecast, you can see there's pretty heavy showers coming in the northern part of the grain belt. Looks like most of Minnesota, North Dakota, parts of South Dakota, across Wisconsin and Michigan are going to get hit with quite a bit of rainfall. Now, again, this is out through September 17th. And so a lot of this really doesn't begin to show up or kind of reach its peak until later next week. There is a little bit wetter here in the eastern corn belt, which I think is important. But since it is coming in kind of mid part of September, I wonder if it's a little too late. But I think they definitely need another rain there to kind of help fill out those beans and the corn, especially the beans. But the fact that it's been so dry and it's another 10 days or 2 weeks yet, maybe it'll help. But I think some of the damage is going to be done. But we do see quite a bit of wet weather in the southeastern region of the U.S., which I think could help kind of build up some of the Mississippi River levels, which have been dropping consistently in the last couple of months. But we still see dry pockets here, especially in kind of central or south central Illinois, eastern Missouri. There's some areas here in northern Illinois. Some of these areas I think have pretty good, decent soil moisture, less so in kind of these areas in Illinois. But there's still quite a bit of rainfall yet to come that I don't know that it's all needed in some of these areas in the west, north, but more seems to be on the way. Kind of shifting to South America, it's still a little bit early yet, but they have already started planting the first crop of corn in Brazil in Rio Grande do Sul, which is the southernmost state there. It's still very early. They have kind of a long planting window that they could plant almost till December for that first crop of corn. But some people like to get it in very early there. There's reports that they're cutting acres by as much as 20% on the first crop corn, which is probably going to end up to beans or possibly wheat, but I think probably mostly beans. Starting September 7th, there are places in Mato Grosso where they can begin planting, but I don't think you're going to see much activity until we get closer to October, to be frank. But so the planting season is officially able to start soon in the center west region, but we don't see much for rainfall in the forecast. For most of the state, it's showing an inch or less. And I think most people would like to get some soaking rains of like 3 inches just to start to build up some soil moisture, because this is after a 5-month dry season. And so the ground is almost like concrete. There's no moisture at all. And so it kind of takes some time for that rainy season to build up. And sometimes you see a head fake where you get a rain and then it goes dry again. So it takes some time to build up, but we'll keep covering that. But I think we're not going to see much activity until later this month or kind of the start of October. That's really when the bulk of the beans in Mato Grosso go in, is October, and a lot of the eastern part of the country puts their beans in November. So it's still pretty early. We did a video last week that got a lot of colorful commentary on the lack of Chinese buying with our soybeans. And I noticed that the American Soybean Association put out some really interesting graphs that I thought kind of painted a good picture of where we're at right now, and kind of show you what's happening with market share between U.S. and Brazilian soybeans, and how the U.S. has been kind of slowly losing market share to Brazil in the case of soybeans. Back in 2018, that Chinese soybean imports, I should say Brazilian soybean exports, 75% of that went to China. And it dropped to 19% in the United States. This goes through 2024, but I think for 2025, we're already seeing that again, where they're maxing out their soybean imports from Brazil and back up to that 75% level or higher. They're trying to buy as much as they can because it's gotten a lot of attention recently, and I think is going to continue to get more attention that they aren't buying anything from the United States. And I don't know that they're going to, unless there's some solution to the trade war discussions going on there. But our concern is most of the focus with the U.S. administration is focused more on other bigger ticket items, national security items, like rare earth minerals and things of that nature. And so I pointed out that China's beginning stocks had steadily been increasing in the last decade, especially since the last trade war. So they've had a lot of time to prepare for this, and I think they kind of saw it coming. And StoneX reported here this week that there's rumors that they've started to kind of dig into their stockpiles that they have on reserve. And so it kind of supports the idea that they're doing all what they can to avoid U.S. purchases right now, it seems, drawing on those stockpiles, I guess, to get by until Brazil's next crop comes online, which really isn't going to start the harvest until January and may not have exports until next February. This is another image. This kind of gives you an idea of where U.S. soybeans are going and how much of our production has been going to China. And you could see that they've consistently purchased 1 billion bushels from us. Those years in 2018 to 2019, when they dropped quite a bit, those were the years of the first trade war that we had with them, and they pulled back spending. So this isn't anything new, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But coming back in 2020, they bought 1.3 billion bushels. So this is a problem if they don't buy anything. You're going to have as much as 500 million to 1 billion bushels that's going to need to find a new home. Some of that will get absorbed by other buyers, but the problem is we can't replace China as a buyer. There's just not enough other options that are out there. So this is, I think, going to be weighing on the market here for the time going forward. Kind of wrapping up, one of the things that I look for when we're in basically a market recession like we are now in the commodities is how farmland values are holding up, because at the end of the day, that's really what keeps things ticking and moving forward. Because if we're going to continue to operate and plant, we need operating capital. A lot of farmers do. And for lenders to advance operating capital, they need collateral, which is typically in the form of farmland. Farmland values are kind of the linchpin of the ag industry, I would say. You can kind of see here what's happened in Iowa farmland over the last 2 decades, which we've had a pretty healthy decline. But you can kind of see here going back to, we peaked there in 2013 following the market run up in 2012. And so there's a pretty obvious correlation, as you would have guessed, from increasing corn prices and an increase in land values. That's no surprise. But I'm trying to get an idea of what we should expect going forward, because we've had a tremendous run up, setting new highs in land prices back in this last cycle where we shot up to a high of around $8,400 per acre on average in 2013, and we kind of bottomed back in 2016. It took 3 years to get to that bottom. So that's maybe lesson one, is it doesn't happen immediately. There's a lag. It took 3 years before the market kind of find its bottom. And land values on average in the state of Iowa gave up roughly $1,500 per acre. Now, I don't know if you can apply that same methodology to what's happening now, but to a certain degree, I think you can. But you kind of see here that this has already started to happen, where we peaked here in 2023, following the run up of prices, where the average corn price in 2022 was $6.75 before it started to recede. And we reached this peak of $11,835 for average farmland value. And now in 2024, we can already look back and see, okay, we started to recede. We gave up $400 per acre. Well, I look at this and say, well, if we gave up $1,500 per acre in this 3-year period, what if we gave up $1,500 from our high in 2023? I mean, that would indicate that land values over the next 2 years, could still give up another $1,000 or more per acre. A lot of it just depends on how long we're in this bottom cycle. And it is a cycle. Eventually we'll cut back production and dig our way out of it, but it just takes time. But you can see there's a pretty big gap from where corn prices have collapsed to where land values are. So it just stands to reason that the land values are going to be set to drop. Now, this isn't a huge cause for alarm. I don't think it's a red flag, because I think most farmers are have pretty strong equity and balance sheet, and their lenders keep them in check. You can kind of see here there wasn't near as much gap between how land values peaked and the decline from when corn prices dropped, but there is one now. And so I don't know that corn prices are going to drop a whole lot further from their $4, $4.25 level. I think the land values are probably going to have to catch up to it, but time will tell. But I just wanted to reiterate how important the farmland values are. At the end of the day, I know liquidity can kind of dry up, but that is one of our big advantages that we have over Brazil, is our liquidity, and is our the lending system and our relatively cheap interest rates. I know a lot of people maybe don't agree with that. I know in my lending operating line, it's closer to 9%, but you have in Brazil, lending is closer to 17% per year. And so it's a big problem there. And that's a big advantage that we do have over Brazil. That's all I have for you today. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.